.NET Interview Questions. .NET Interview Questions and Answers Part 1. What is the difference between early binding and late binding? Calling a non-virtual method decided at a compile time is known as early binding. Calling a virtual method pure polymorphism decided at runtime is known as late binding. What is reflection? All .NET compilers produce metadata about the types defined in the modules they produce. This metadata is packaged along with the modules in turn are packaged together in assemblies and can be accessed by a mechanism called reflection. The system.reflection namespace contains classes that can be used to interrogate the types for a module or assembly. What is ASP.NET? ASP.NET is a server-side scripting technology that enables scripts embedded in web pages to be executed by an internet server. ASP.NET provides increased performance by running compiled code. What is the difference between Classic ASP and ASP.NET? ASP is interpreted language based on scripting languages like JavaScript or VBScript. ASP has mixed HTML and coding logic, limited development and debugging tools available, limited WIPS support, limited session and application state management. ASP.NET is supported by compiler and has compiled language support. Separate code and design logic possible. Variety of compilers and tools available including the Visual Studio.NET, completely object-oriented, complete session and application state management, full XML support for easy data exchange. What is difference between namespace and assembly? Namespace is a logical design time naming convenience, whereas an assembly establishes the name scope for types at runtime. What is the difference between server.transfer and response.Redirect? The server.transfer method stops the current page from executing and runs the content on the specified page. When the execution is complete, the control is passed back to the calling page, while the response.Redirect method transfers the control on the specified page and the control is never passed back to calling page after execution. What is a postback? The process in which a web page sends data back to the same page on the server. What is the difference between static or dynamic assemblies? Assemblies can be static or dynamic. Static assemblies can include .NET framework types, interfaces and classes as well as resources for the assembly bitmaps, JPEG files, resource files, and so on. Static assemblies are stored on disk in portable executable PE files. Dynamic assemblies, which are run directly from memory and are not saved to disk before execution. You can save dynamic assemblies to disk after they have executed. What are the difference between structure and class? Structures are value type and classes are reference type. Structures cannot have constructor or destructors. Classes can have both constructor and destructors. Structures do not support inheritance, while classes support inheritance. What is the differences between dataset.clone and dataset.copy? Dataset.clone copies just the structure of dataset including all the data tables, schemas, relations and constraints. However, it does not copy the data. Dataset.copy copies both the dataset structure and the data. What is the difference between custom control and user control? Custom controls are compiled code, the LLs easier to use, difficult to create, and can be placed in toolbox. Drag and drop controls. Attributes can be set visually at design time. Can be used by multiple applications if shared. The LLs, even if private, can copy to bin directory of web application at reference and use. Normally designed to provide common functionality independent of consuming application. User controls are similar to those of ASP, include files. Easy to create, can't not be placed in the toolbox and dragged, dropped from it. The user control is shared among the single application files. What is the difference between ASP session state and ASP.NET session state? ASP session state relies on cookies, serialize all requests from a client, does not survive process shutdown, can't not be maintained across machines in a web farm. What namespace does a web page belong in the .NET Framework class hierarchy? System.web.UI.page. What is a bubbled event? When you have a complex control, like datagrid, writing an event processing routine for each object, cell, button, row, etc. is quite tedious. The controls can bubble up their event handlers, allowing the main datagrid event handler to take care of its constituents. What is the differences between server-side and client-side code? Server-side code executes on the server. Client-side code executes in the client's browser. What is view state? Viewed state is a .NET mechanism to store the posted data among postbacks. Viewed state allows the state of objects to be stored in a hidden field on the page, saved on client side and transported back to server whenever required. What is authentication and authorization? Authentication is the process of identifying users. Authentication is identifying or validating the user against the credentials, username and password, and authorization performs after authentication. Authorization is the process of granting access to those users based on identity. Authorization allowing access of specific resource to user. What are the types of authentication? There are 3 types of authentication: Windows, Forms and Passport authentication. Windows authentication uses the security features integrated into the Windows NT and Windows XP operating systems to authenticate and authorize web application users. Forms authentication allows you to create your own list or database of users and validate the identity of those users. Then they visit your website. Passport authentication uses the Microsoft centralized authentication provider to identify users. Passport provides a way for users to use a single identity across multiple web applications. To use Passport authentication in your web application, you must install the Passport SDK. What is datagrid? The datagrid web server control is a powerful tool for displaying information from a data source. It is easy to use. You can display editable data in a professional-looking grid by setting only a few properties. At the same time, the grid has a sophisticated object model that provides you with great flexibility in how you display the data. How many languages .NET is supporting now? When .NET was introduced, it came with several languages: VB.NET, C#, COBOL and Perl, etc. The site .NET Languages.net says 44 languages are supported. What is Smart Navigation? The cursor position is maintained when the page gets refreshed to the server-side validation and the page gets refreshed. How do you validate the controls in an ASP.NET page? Using special validation controls that are meant for this. We have RangeValidator, Email Validator. How do you hide the columns? One way to have columns appear dynamically is to create them at design time, and then to hide or show them as needed. You can do this by setting the column's visible property. What are different types of directives in .NET? That page, at control, at import, at implements, at register, at assembly, at output cache, at reference. What data type does the RangeValidator control support? 1 integer, 2 string, 3 date. What is cookies? Cookies are small pieces of text stored on the client's computer to be used only by the website setting the cookies. This allows web applications to save information for the user, and then reuse it on each page if needed. What is the difference between server-side scripting and client-side scripting? Server-side scripting means that all the script will be executed by the server and interpreted as needed. ASP doesn't have some of the functionality like sockets, uploading, etc. Client-side scripting means that the script will be executed immediately in the browser, such as form field validation, clock, email validation, etc. Client-side scripting is usually done in VBScript or JavaScript. How do you create a permanent cookie? Permanent cookies are available until a specified expiration date, and are stored on the hard disk. So set the expires property any value greater than datetime. Minimum value with respect to the current datetime. If you want a cookie which never expires, set its expires property equal to datetime.max value. Which method do you use to redirect the user to another page without performing a round trip to the client? Server.transfer, server.execute. Which method do you use to redirect the user to another page without performing a round trip to the client? Server.transfer. How do you turn off cookies for one page in your site? Use cookie.discard property. Gets or sets the discard flag set by the server. When true, this property instructs the client application not to save the cookie on the user's hard disk when a session ends. Which two properties are on every validation control? We have two common properties for every validation controls. 1. Control to validate. 2. Error message. What is boxing and unboxing? Implicit conversion of value type to reference type of a variable is known as boxing. For example, integer to object type conversion. Conversion of reference type variable back to value type is called as unboxing. What is garbage collection? Garbage collection is a system whereby a runtime component takes responsibility for managing the lifetime of objects and the heap memory that they occupy. What is the use of @rate register directives? @rate register directive informs the compiler of any custom server control added to the page. What is the difference between ASP session state and ASP.NET session state? ASP session state relies on cookies, serialize all requests from a client, does not survive process shutdown, cannot maintained across machines in a web farm. What is the difference between ASP session and ASP.NET session? ASP.NET session supports cookie-less session and it can span across multiple servers. Define required field validator. It checks whether the controls have any value. It is used when you want the control should not be empty. What are the different types of session state management options available with ASP.NET? ASP.NET provides in-process and out-of-process state management. In-process stores the session in memory on the web server. Out-of-process session state management stores data in an external data source. The external data source may be either a SQL server or a state server service. Out-of-process state management requires that all objects stored in session are serializable.